Welcome to Legends of Humanity, the global history channel that brings to life the stories of remarkable individuals who changed the world. In today's journey, we explore the life of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the legendary president of the United States who led his nation through the Great Depression and World War II. From a man confined to a wheelchair by polio, he rose to become a timeless symbol of resilience, compassion, and unshakable belief in democracy, leaving behind not just a stronger America, but a legacy that continues to inspire humanity. On a crisp morning in 1882, in the quiet estate of Hyde Park nestled beside the Hudson River in New York, a newborn named Franklin Delano Roosevelt let out his first cry. No one could have foreseen that this child born into luxury, raised in one of America's most aristocratic families, would one day lead the United States through its darkest hours. Franklin belonged to the Roosevelt family, a lineage of immense wealth, influence, and tradition in the Northeastern elite. The Roosevelts weren't just landowners. They were a political dynasty with deep roots in American society. His father, James Roosevelt, was a classic gentleman, calm, wise, and a product of the old money world. His mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, came from a prominent mercantile family with strong ties to financiers and political elites. She would become the single most dominant figure in young Franklin's early life. From the moment he was born, Franklin was enveloped in the comfort of wealth. The grand estate at Hyde Park was not just a home, it was a secluded world, carefully curated to reflect the stature of the family. Unlike most children, Franklin did not attend a public or private kindergarten. Instead, his mother personally oversaw his education at home. Sarah was strict and composed, sometimes to the point of suffocation. But it was she who instilled in Franklin a deep sense of discipline, order, and moral duty. Though surrounded by abundance, Franklin was not spoiled. He wasn't allowed to mingle freely with children from lower social classes. His companions were books, maps, and ideas. Each year, the Roosevelt family traveled across the Atlantic, exposing young Franklin to the breadth of European culture. He studied French in Paris, picked up German in Bad Nauheim, and absorbed the grandeur of cathedrals, castles, and museums. These formative travels would plant in him a lifelong sense of international awareness. Franklin was an introspective yet confident child. He loved horseback riding, sailing, and reading history. He had an impressive memory and a natural curiosity about the world. But above all, people noticed his unusual composure, calm and thoughtful demeanor far beyond his years. That inner tranquility, cultivated by his father's silent strength and his mother's firm guidance, would later prove essential in navigating the storms of adulthood. Unlike many boys his age, Franklin didn't crave boisterous games or loud adventures. He was drawn instead to study, reflection, and solitude. Even in summer, when most children played outdoors, Franklin could often be found reading, writing in his diary, or studying famous speeches from American history. To his peers, he seemed distant, perhaps even odd, but he carried a quiet confidence, as though following an invisible path only he could see. His childhood was like an ornate tapestry richly woven, yet taught with expectation and isolation. It was a childhood without hardship, but also without freedom. Within that golden cocoon, however, a strong spirit was quietly being forged a soul, being shaped for a mission greater than he could yet understand. At age 14, that path began to take shape. Franklin was about to leave the serenity of Hyde Park and step into the world of elite education and political heritage, a journey that would lead him into the very heart of American power, and ultimately into the pages of world history. The flame from Harvard to Columbia. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt left Hyde Park to enter the world of academics, he carried not just the weight of a privileged upbringing, but also the quiet expectations of the Roosevelt lineage. At 14, he enrolled at Grotona prestigious boarding school, reserved for the sons of America's elite. It wasn't just a gateway to knowledge, it was a crucible for the soul, where young men born into wealth were tested in character and conviction. At Groton, Franklin faced real competition for the first time. His classmates were not only brilliant but also ambitious and assertive. While others sought the spotlight, Franklin remained composed. He wasn't the top student, but his patience, courtesy, and innate sense of responsibility gradually earned him the respect of peers and teachers alike. One of the most influential figures in Franklin's early education was Groton's headmaster, Endicott P. Boja, minister and educator who believed the privileged few had a duty to serve the many. That idea left a lasting imprint on Franklin, planting the belief that power held meaning only when tied to responsibility and public service. It was the first seed of the citizen leader philosophy that would guide him for the rest of his life. In 1900, Franklin entered Harvard University, the crown jewel of elite Northeastern education. There, a new chapter began. A young man stepping into a realm of great minds, intellectual debates, and vibrant student politics. Though not a standout academically, Franklin's confidence, social grace, and adaptability quickly made him a familiar presence among student organizations. A pivotal moment during his Harvard years came when he was invited to join the staff of the Harvard Crimson, the university's official newspaper. As a writer and editor, he honed his skills in critical thinking, persuasive writing, and political observation. His articles, though not revolutionary, revealed an emerging engagement with national issues and a growing desire to influence public discourse. Throughout college, the towering legacy of his famous cousin former President Theodore Roosevelt loomed large in Franklin's mind. Theodore was a man of vigor, reform, and unyielding patriotism, a living symbol of what a Roosevelt could become. Franklin admired him deeply. And though their personalities differed, the elder Roosevelt's fiery example became a constant source of inspiration, nudging Franklin toward a life beyond comfort and complacency. After graduating from Harvard in 1903, Franklin pursued law studies at Columbia University, but his passion began to wane. The rigid structure of legal training did not excite him, and long hours in the library did little to stir his active mind. Less than 3 years in, he left Columbia without obtaining a degree, a bold move, but not a reckless one. By then, the pool of public life had already begun to take hold. He secured a position at a prestigious New York law firm thanks in part to family connections, but the law was never meant to be his final destination. Beneath the surface, something deeper was stirring, an urge to serve, a calling to enter politics, and a desire to shape America's future on his own terms. Franklin Roosevelt's academic path was not marked by accolades or honors, but by a steady refinement of character. These years sharpened his thinking, expanded his worldview, and most importantly, ignited an inner flame. A relentless drive to serve his country, to pursue ideals, and to leave a legacy far greater than himself. The shadow of Theodore Roosevelt, a great relative and a lasting influence. In the early years of the 20th century, America was transforming, shifting from a predominantly agricultural nation into an industrial power, from a collection of states into a unified federation. Amid this profound transition, one name stood out, both controversial and inspirational: President Theodore Roosevelt, the cousin of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Theodore wasn't just a relative. To Franklin, he was a living monument. Though the two didn't grow up together and were separated by a significant age gap, young Franklin was captivated by his cousin's powerful, image-bold, unyielding, and burning with reformist zeal. Theodore was a man of action, unafraid of conflict, and always ready to challenge entrenched interests for the sake of the public good. While studying away from home, Franklin would often hear tales of Theodore's daring feats, from leading the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War to his audacious reforms as president. To Franklin, Theodore wasn't merely a politician. He was the embodiment of courage, idealism, and the unshakable belief that what is right must be done no matter the cost. Theodore's influence extended beyond ideals. It shaped Franklin's view of political life. Some jokingly referred to Franklin as Theodore II, and rather than shy away from that towering legacy, Franklin embraced it. He studied how his cousin used the press to reach the public, how he navigated politics with both charisma and strategic skill. Franklin didn't seek to imitate, but he learned the power of inspiration, the art of public image, and the ability to turn vision into action. And yet, from the shadow of Theodore, Franklin realized something profound. True leadership couldn't rely on heritage or a famous name alone. It required a distinct path, a personal identity, and a mission, all his own. That is why, in his early political journey, Franklin chose to begin humbly, not by riding the coattails of a legacy, but by stepping into the messy, local world of grassroots politics. In 1910, at the age of 28, Franklin ran for the New York State Senate. It was a bold move. Few believed a young, relatively inexperienced lawyer could defeat the entrenched political machine. But Franklin won, and he won convincingly. His campaign, rooted in outreach to farmers, laborers, and the youth, proved that he was more than a Roosevelt by blood. He was Franklin, a man with his own voice and ideals. From that moment forward, Theodore's shadow began to recede, not from rejection, but from fulfillment. Franklin no longer needed to stand in his cousin's light to shine. He had found his own path, a path not defined by mimicry, but by integrity, a path where greatness would not be inherited, but earned by serving something greater than oneself. Love and politics, marrying Eleanor, the partner and the comrade amid the glittering halls of early 20th century New York high society, where ballroom dances sparkled and formal conversations echoed beneath crystal chandeliers. Young Franklin Delano Roosevelt, heir to a noble American lineage, met the woman who would forever alter the course of his life, Eleanor Roosevelt. They were distant cousins. Eleanor was the niece of President Theodore Roosevelt, while Franklin came from a different branch of the same prominent family. But kinship did little to diminish the quiet force drawing them together. Eleanor was not the typical pampered debutante. Orphaned at a young age and raised in a strict, affectionless environment, she developed a deep inner life, shaped by hardship and a quiet desire to transcend the limits of traditional womanhood. Franklin was drawn not just to Eleanor's gentle exterior, but to the depth in her worldview. Eleanor, in turn, admired Franklin's confidence, generosity of spirit, and commitment to public service. Their bond was built not merely on affection, but on intellectual companionship. They talked about more than family. They talked about justice, society, and the future of the country. In 1905, they married. Their wedding was a grand affair, graced by the presence of President Theodore Roosevelt himself, who played the dual role of uncle and father figure, bestowing his blessing on the couple. Yet beneath the splendor of the ceremony lay the beginnings of a journey that would be anything but easy. The marriage of Franklin and Eleanor was not a romantic fairy tale. Franklin, with his outgoing nature and love of political life, often clashed with Eleanor's more reserved, introspective character. But their differences became a source of strength. While Franklin plunged into politics, Eleanor slowly discovered her own voice, first through charity work, then through deeper engagement in issues like education, labor rights, and women's equality. Their family life faced numerous trials. They had 6 children together, though not all were healthy or emotionally fulfilled. Eleanor bore the weight of motherhood and the expectations of being the wife of an ambitious politician. She often felt alone in her own home. And then, in 1918, came the deepest wound when she discovered Franklin's affair with his secretary, Lucy Mercer. It shattered her. She could have left. Many expected her to, but she didn't. Because Eleanor was not just Franklin's wife, she was his comrade. From that moment forward, their relationship transformed. No longer solely romantic, it became a partnership rooted in ideals, respect, and a shared mission to serve something greater than themselves. Eleanor became indispensable to Franklin's political life. She was his eyes and ears on social issues, his moral compass, his challenger, and his quiet strength. She inspired him, confronted him, and pushed him to grow. She was not merely a spouse, she was a force beside him. Their love was not perfect, but in its imperfection, it became extraordinary. In a world where marriage was often confined by traditional roles, Franklin and Eleanor forged something new, a political partnership that made history. Into the abyss, paralysis, inner battles, and an unbreakable will to live in 1921, at the age of 39, Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood on the cusp of political greatness. He had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I, emerged as a rising star in the Democratic Party, and was widely seen as a future governor or even president. With his tall frame, confident presence, and commanding voice, few doubted that Franklin was destined for the highest office in the land. But destiny, as it often does, took an unexpected and cruel turn. While vacationing with his family on Campobello Island, a scenic retreat off the coast of Canada, Franklin began to feel unwell, feverish, sore, and weak. Within days, his legs gave out. He could no longer stand. Doctors diagnosed him with poliomyelitis. In an instant, the path of his life collapsed into uncertainty and fear. For a man who had embodied vigor and ambition, paralysis wasn't just the loss of movement, it was a devastating blow to pride and identity. Franklin was forced to confront not only physical pain, but the emotional storm of helplessness, shame, and the looming fear that his public life might be over. In the first months, Franklin withdrew. He remained in dark rooms, declined visitors, and avoided the press. The sound of his wheelchair on the wooden floor echoed like a cruel reminder of what he had lost. But in that silence, a different kind of battle began, it with the disease itself, but with despair. And in that darkness, Franklin made a decision. He would not let illness define him. Though his legs no longer worked, his mind and heart still burned with purpose. With the unwavering support of Eleanor's steadfast companion and his mother Sarah, Franklin began the arduous search for recovery. He tried physical therapy, warm water treatments, and strength exercises focused on the few muscles that remained responsive. None of it restored his ability to walk, but it restored something more important: his resolve. In 1924, Franklin heard of a place called Warm Springs, a resort in Georgia with natural hot springs rumored to aid polio patients. He visited and immediately sensed something different, not just in the water, but in the spirit of the people. The patients smiled, struggled, laughed, and persevered. Franklin did not just seek treatment, purchased the facility, and transformed it into a modern rehabilitation center for the disabled. Warm Springs became more than a physical refuge. It was where he rebuilt his soul slowly, painfully, day by day. There, among other patients, he shed the shame of his condition. He learned to resonate with his feet, but with courage. And it was there that he made another bold decision. He would return to politics. Even if he had to use crutches, braces, or a wheelchair, Franklin believed that a man's worth was not determined by his body, but by his ideals and actions. To advisors who urged him to abandon political life, Franklin calmly replied, "If I can conquer myself, I can conquer anything." From the depths of illness, Franklin Roosevelt emerged not diminished, but transformed more resilient, more empathetic, and more attuned to the struggles of ordinary people. For he had tasted pain, loneliness, and the fragile nature of hope in the dark. It wasn't just a turning point. It was a rebirth preparing him for the greatest challenge history would soon place in his hands: resurrection at Warm Springs, reclaiming body, spirit, and political destiny in the sun-drenched hills of Georgia, where the gentle murmur of springs flowed through quiet woods. Franklin Delano Roosevelt found a place that offered more than physical relief, it offered rebirth. Warm Springs, a humble hot springs resort, became the unlikely sanctuary where a man broken by illness began to piece himself back together, not just in body, but in spirit. When Franklin first arrived in 1924, he came not as a politician, but as a patient in search of hope. For hours each day, he immersed himself in the warm mineral waters, feeling the tightness in his legs ease, the weight of pain lighten. But what truly tethered him to this place wasn't the water, it was the people. Children with polio who still laughed. Adults who bore their suffering with quiet determination. No one here had surrendered. And neither would he. Franklin fell in love with the place not as a retreat, but as a mission. He used his own funds to purchase the property and transform it into a modern rehabilitation center, the Roosevelt Warm Springs Institute for Rehabilitation. He did not do this for recognition. He did it because he understood intimately the despair that came with disability, and he wanted to build a refuge for dignity and hope. At Warm Springs, Franklin shed the formal trappings of wealth. He swam, practiced walking in wooden bars, wheeled through the sunlit courtyards, and dined with other patients. No one called him Mr. Roosevelt. He was simply Frank, and he welcomed it. It was here, among those often forgotten by society, that Franklin forged a new bond with the everyday American. His heart, once shaped by privilege, began to expand with empathy. In those sunlit days and quiet nights, Franklin reached a revelation. Leadership was not about perfection. It was about presence, about listening, about rising beyond one's own suffering to serve others. He emerged from Warm Springs not just rehabilitated, but transformed. He was no longer just a patrician with ambition. He had become a citizen leader with compassion. Then came the call. In 1928, the Democratic Party sought a candidate for governor of New York. Franklin's name resurfaced. Many doubted him. A man in a wheelchair, they whispered, could not govern. But Franklin, supported by Eleanor and a growing circle of allies, accepted the challenge and made a stunning decision. He would campaign while standing, with steel braces, a cane, and meticulously practiced movements. Franklin could stand for brief periods in public. He trained relentlessly, not to walk again, but to demonstrate strength. At rallies, he spoke with fire and humor. He smiled through pain, and the crowds no longer saw a crippled man. They saw a leader returning from exile, and he won. In that 1928 election, Franklin Roosevelt became the governor of New York. But more than a political victory, it was a triumph of spirit. A man who had once hidden in dark rooms, defeated and silent, now stood literally and figuratively before a state, ready to lead. Warm Springs did more than heal his limbs. It forged a new Franklin, humble, resilient, deeply human, and ready to face a world in turmoil. The road to the White House, conquering crisis, becoming president in 1933. In the late 1920s, America basked in the illusion of prosperity. Skyscrapers soared above Manhattan, Wall Street buzzed with unending optimism, and the middle class believed the American dream was within reach. But beneath the glittering surface, tremors were gathering. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Within months, millions lost their jobs, thousands of banks collapsed, and bread lines became a grim feature of every major city. The Great Depression had begun, and the nation spiraled into fear, poverty, and paralysis. Amid this unraveling, Franklin D. Roosevelt, then governor of New York, stood apart. While other states slashed spending, Franklin expanded public relief programs. He created agencies to support the unemployed, provide food aid, and launch public works projects. Though resources were limited, he sent a clear message. Government could and must stand with the people in their darkest hour. His bold leadership in New York caught national attention. Americans began to see in Franklin a rare blend of courage, compassion, and resolve. In 1932, as the country desperately searched for new direction, the Democratic Party nominated him as their presidential candidate. The 1932 campaign was more than a political contest. It was a test of the nation's soul. Incumbent President Herbert Hoover appeared distant and overwhelmed, while Roosevelt emerged as a voice of hope. He didn't downplay the crisis, but he also didn't surrender to despair. Instead, he spoke of renewal, of a new deal for the American people. In speech after speech, Roosevelt didn't merely address crowds, he spoke directly to the hearts of suffering individuals. To the family who lost their farm, to the father unable to feed his children. His voice, measured, warm, and unshaken by physical limitation, resonated deeply. People didn't see a man in a wheelchair. They saw someone who had fallen and found the strength to rise again. In November 1932, Roosevelt achieved one of the most resounding victories in American electoral history. He secured over 57% of the popular vote and dominated the Electoral College. The nation rejoiced, not just in a political win, but in the fragile return of hope. Yet that hope was immediately tested. When Roosevelt took the oath of office on March 4, 1933, America was at its nadir. Banks were failing at a terrifying pace. Panic gripped the streets. Trust in government had all but evaporated. Standing before a crowd that mirrored the nation's anxiety, he didn't offer platitudes or promises, offered a challenge wrapped in clarity. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. With those words, Franklin Roosevelt did more than calm a frightened country. He launched a new chapter in American history. The journey ahead would be turbulent, but the captain had taken the helm. The New Deal, a way out of despair. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt entered the White House in 1933, he didn't inherit a nation, he inherited a disaster. Over 13 million Americans were unemployed, thousands of banks had failed. People had lost their homes, their farms, and, most devastatingly, their hope. Bread lines stretched across city blocks, dust storms ravaged the Great Plains, and families wandered the roads in search of work and dignity. It was the bleakest moment in American memory, and in that atmosphere of despair, Roosevelt set in motion something unprecedented: the New Deal. The New Deal wasn't a single policy, but a sweeping set of reforms, programs, and laws aimed at rescuing the American economy from collapse. It reached into every sector: banking, agriculture, labor, infrastructure, education, even the arts, and it did so with urgency, scale, and determination. In just his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt and Congress passed over 15 major pieces of legislation, a record unmatched in U.S. history. He temporarily closed all banks for inspection, then reopened only those deemed solvent, restoring public trust in the financial system. He created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, to protect citizens' savings. These were emergency measures, but they were only the beginning. Roosevelt understood that economic rescue required more than money, it required restoring faith. That's why he launched a series of massive public work programs. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, hired young men to plant forests and build parks. The Public Works Administration, PWA, constructed schools, roads, and hospitals. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, gave jobs to artists, musicians, and writers, ensuring that creativity would not die in an age of survival. The New Deal wasn't just about dollars. It was about dignity. For the first time, Americans saw the federal government not as a distant machine, but as a partner, a protector. Letters poured into the White House from every corner of the country, pleas for help, notes of gratitude, stories of hardship. Roosevelt read them. He answered many. And through his fireside chat symbol, comforting radio addresses spoke directly to the people, demystifying policy, reassuring the frightened. Americans didn't hear a politician. They heard a neighbor, a father, a friend. Of course, not everyone supported the New Deal. Wall Street elites accused Roosevelt of overreach. Conservative politicians warned of creeping socialism. But Roosevelt was undeterred. He wasn't searching for perfection, he was searching for solutions. He was willing to fail, to try again, to learn in motion, so long as he didn't stand still. The New Deal didn't solve every problem. By the end of the 1930s, full recovery had not yet come. But something far more vital had returned: confidence. The spirit of the nation had lifted. And most importantly, Roosevelt redefined a fundamental truth. The government has a responsibility to care for the well-being of its people. That shift wasn't just economic, it was philosophical. It changed the root of American democracy, and it would echo for generations to come. Trial by fire, leading through the Great Depression, facing resistance and constitutional crisis. The early success of the New Deal did not smooth the road ahead for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On the contrary, the deeper he delved into reform, the fiercer the resistance became. What he had set in motion was transforming America. And with transformation came confrontation, with institutions, with ideology, and with the Constitution itself. To the financial elite, Roosevelt was a traitor to his class. Bankers, industrialists, and insurers attacked him in editorials and boardrooms, branding him a destroyer of free enterprise, a demagogue pandering to the masses. Conservative newspapers painted a portrait of a president steering the nation toward disguised collectivism. Even within his own Democratic Party, doubts began to surface. Some colleagues feared the breakneck pace of reform, worried over the ballooning federal budget, and balked at the growing reach of the central government. But the most formidable opposition came from the United States Supreme Court, the very institution tasked with safeguarding the Constitution and one of the most conservative arms of government at the time. Between 1935 and 1936, the Supreme Court began striking down key elements of the New Deal, ruling that many programs violated economic liberties or overstepped federal authority. For Roosevelt, once hailed as a savior, it was a sobering confrontation with the rigid walls of institutional power. This was a crucible moment, and Roosevelt did not back down. In 1937, he proposed a dramatic and controversial plan to restructure the Supreme Court by increasing the number of justices from 9 to 15. Officially, he claimed the court needed to be modernized and made more efficient. But the political reality was clear. He aimed to shift the court's balance by appointing younger, more progressive judges. The backlash was swift and severe. The press labeled it the court packing scheme. Even Roosevelt's staunchest allies grew uneasy. His approval ratings dropped. Congress, dominated by his own party, refused to support the plan. It was, by all appearances, a bitter defeat. And yet, something unexpected occurred. Shortly after Roosevelt's failed proposal, the Supreme Court began changing course. Key conservative justices started voting to uphold New Deal legislation. Historians would later call it the switch in time that saved 9. The court remained untouched in structure, but its rulings began to align with Roosevelt's vision. Though the legal reform failed, Roosevelt had won in substance through relentless pressure and the sheer gravity of public opinion. This moment revealed a deeper truth about Franklin Roosevelt. He was not a reformer driven by vanity, but a leader willing to confront power, even constitutional power, when he believed the fate of the nation demanded it. He walked the razor's edge between authority and democracy. He knew how fragile that balance was. And while he occasionally stepped too far, he never stepped away from his commitment to the American people. When faced with fire, the weak dissolve, but the strong are forged. Roosevelt had passed through that fire, not unscathed, but tempered, resilient, and shining with greater clarity than ever before. Darkness rising, entering the World War II's, the wounds of the Great Depression slowly began to heal. A darker storm gathered beyond America's shores war. In Europe, Adolf Hitler rose with terrifying charisma, manipulating Germany's post-World War I resentment into fanatic nationalism. In Asia, Japan expanded its brutal conquest, invading Manchuria and unleashing destruction across China. The world was slipping into chaos, and the American people, still weary from economic collapse, wanted no part in another global conflict. Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood that sentiment deeply. He had served during the First World War, seen its cost, and knew the scars it left behind. When war erupted in Europe in 1939, Roosevelt declared America's neutrality, vowing to keep the nation out of foreign entanglements. Congress passed a series of laws restricting arms sales, loans, and military involvement abroad. But Roosevelt also knew that neutrality could not mean blindness. Behind the scenes, he quietly expanded America's military capabilities, strengthening the Navy, investing in defense industries, and monitoring Hitler's growing aggression. One by one, he watched Germany invade Poland, overrun France, and bombard the skies over London. Though still measured in tone, Roosevelt had come to a quiet conclusion. America could not stand aside forever. In March 1941, he convinced Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act, allowing the United States to supply arms and materials to nations resisting fascists, primarily Britain and later the Soviet Union. Roosevelt likened it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire, America was not yet at war, but it was no longer on the sidelines. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the threat from Japan escalated. After the US imposed an embargo on oil and steel, diplomatic tensions grew dire. Roosevelt continued negotiations, hoping to buy time, but he knew in his heart that war was coming. Then came December 7, 1941, the day that changed everything. Without warning, Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. More than 400 American servicemen were killed. Battleships and aircraft were reduced to smoke and ruin. The nation, stunned and enraged, awoke to the reality it had long tried to avoid. The next day, Roosevelt appeared before Congress, his face solemn, his voice steady and resolute. December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. He asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan. The vote was nearly unanimous. Soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States and Roosevelt. Once the president of recovery became the president of war. It was a turning point not just for Roosevelt, but for the world. He had led America through an economic catastrophe. Now, he would lead it through a war that would determine the future of civilization, leading through fire, redrawing the world with Churchill and Stalin. When the United States officially entered World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became more than just the president of a nation. He became the strategic and moral leader of the free world. His burden was no longer limited to economic recovery. Now he carried the weight of civilization itself, threatened by the growing darkness of fascism in Europe and the Pacific. War, however, was not a solitary endeavor. To win, Roosevelt needed allies, chief. Among them were Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. Churchill, Britain's prime minister, was a man of unshakable will, razor-sharp words, and relentless resolve. Stalin, the Soviet Union's enigmatic and ruthless leader, was cold, calculating, and essential to the global chessboard. Three men, three personalities, three ideologies, and yet one shared mission: to destroy fascism. Roosevelt played the role of mediator diplomatic adhesive, holding the fragile alliance together. He convened summit after summit, despite distance, language barriers, and mutual suspicion. Tehran, 1943, and Yalta, 1945, became the cornerstones of Allied cooperation meetings that would not only direct the war effort, but redraw the post-war world. At Tehran, Roosevelt committed to opening a second front in Western Europe, a promise that eased the enormous pressure on Soviet forces battling Hitler in the East. At Yalta, the Big Three negotiated the future of Europe, the division of Germany, the liberation of occupied nations, and the creation of a new global institution, the United Nations, an idea Roosevelt had long championed. But wartime leadership was more than conferences and handshakes. It was the orchestration of an unprecedented effort. Millions of soldiers, billions of dollars, entire industries repurposed for war. Roosevelt transformed the United States into the arsenal of democracy, churning out planes, tanks, and ships at a pace the world had never seen. At home, Roosevelt ensured that the American people were not passive observers. Through his radio broadcasts, he brought them into the struggle, explaining goals, sharing progress, and instilling resolve. Mothers, workers, farmers, and engineers all became part of the victory machine. This was not just a military campaign. It was a national movement driven by belief. Roosevelt also faced agonizing decisions, accepting casualties, delaying offensives, and at times compromising with Stalin to preserve the fragile alliance. Critics accused him of being too idealistic, too trusting. But Roosevelt wasn't thinking only of winning the war, he was thinking about the peace that must follow, a world order that would not slide again into global catastrophe. He once said, "If we do not learn to live together as brothers, we will perish together as fools." Amid bombs and battlefield fire, Roosevelt ensured that America was not merely fighting but leading, not just surviving but offering hope for a world reborn. Eleanor Roosevelt, the steadfast pillar behind the presidency, In the history of the United States, many first ladies have been remembered for their elegance, charm, and ceremonial grace for hosting state dinners, welcoming dignitaries, and maintaining decorum. But Eleanor Roosevelt was different. She wasn't just the wife of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, she was his comrade, his conscience, his eyes and ears, and often his moral compass during the most pivotal presidency of the 20th century. From the moment Franklin entered the White House in 1933, Eleanor shattered every convention of what a first lady was expected to be. She refused to remain a passive figure behind the scenes. Instead, she traveled extensively and relentlessly across the country. She visited the poorest neighborhoods, migrant camps, inner-city schools, and dangerous factories. She listened, took notes, and brought back to her husband the realities no political advisor could truly convey. After polio robbed Franklin of his mobility, Eleanor became his surrogate Lemsche's movement and his messenger. She went where he could not, saw what he could not, and spoke to those he could not reach. She returned with unfiltered, truth raw, unpolished, and essential. But Eleanor was not merely a vessel for his insight. She had a voice of her own. She wrote columns, gave speeches, held regular press conferences, becoming the first lady in U.S. history to speak directly to the press, especially to women reporters. Her daily column, My Day, ran for years and offered a powerful blend of policy, commentary, personal reflection, and quiet but forceful advocacy on education, racial justice, women's rights, and civil liberties. When war erupted, Eleanor did not fade quietly into the background. On the contrary, she visited wounded soldiers in field hospitals, encouraged women working in factories, inspected refugee camps, and held officials accountable for the treatment of minorities and the poor. She became a constant presence, not in photographs, but in action, relentlessly pushing for compassion in a time of chaos. Inside the White House, she was both an ally and a challenger. She disagreed with her husband openly and often. Sometimes, Franklin grew irritated. Sometimes, he resisted. But always she listened, because he knew Eleanor didn't speak only for herself. She echoed the conscience of a nation. Their marriage had long evolved beyond conventional love. It had been tested by heartbreak and shaped by distance. But from those trials emerged something stronger, a bond of trust, a partnership rooted in shared ideals and an unwavering belief in each other's purpose. Franklin once said, "Eleanor has helped me become the man I never had the courage to be on my own." In moments when the world threatened to crush him under its weight, she was the quiet light in the background, never demanding attention, yet always radiating strength. While others rested on titles or fame, Eleanor labored tirelessly, fueled by a conviction that the country and the world could be more just, more humane, more whole. She was not merely the first lady, she was the first of her kind. And in the tapestry of American history, her name remains inseparable from the virtues of courage, compassion, and visionary womanhood. War, peace, and the weight of mortality A's. The Second World War neared its final chapters. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had led the United States through the most turbulent decade of the 20th century, began to feel a weight heavier than any political burden. It was not just the weight of war. It was the toll of time, illness, and exhaustion, slowly overtaking a man who had long defied both gravity and fate. Roosevelt had never been one to complain. Since contracting polio in 1921, he had carefully crafted a public image of strength and resilience. In front of cameras and microphones, he smiled, he stood with assistance, he spoke with unwavering clarity, but in private, his body was failing. His doctors knew the truth, but Roosevelt refused to make it public. He feared that any sign of weakness would shake national confidence at a moment when stability was everything. His blood pressure soared, his heart weakened, his weight dropped, his face grew gaunt, but his schedule remained relentless. He met with generals, conferred with Churchill and Stalin, planned for post-war reconstruction, and prepared for the founding of the United Nations. Every task was a burden and he carried them all quietly. Eleanor worried, his advisors worried, but Roosevelt would only smile and say, "I'll rest when the war is over." In February 1945, he traveled to the Yalta Conference, where the future of the world was being redrawn. Those who saw him there noticed a change: his steps slower, his voice fainter, his eyes dimmer. Yet he remained at the table for hours, negotiating, shaping agreements, laying the groundwork for a new world order. He knew he had little time left. That knowledge only fueled his urgency. Back in the United States, he refused to slow down. He prepared for an unprecedented fourth term as president. In January 1945, he took the oath of office, this time in a quiet ceremony at the White House, without parades or celebration. He was too frail to stand long in the winter wind. By March, Roosevelt retreated to Warm Springs, the place that had once helped him heal 2 decades before. He brought his correspondence, his speech drafts, his notes for the upcoming United Nations conference. But this time, Warm Springs was not a place of recovery, it was a place of quiet farewell. On April 12, 1945, while seated and working at his desk, Roosevelt collapsed from a massive cerebral hemorrhage. His final words were, "I have a terrific headache." Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 31st President of the United States, architect of recovery, wartime commander, died just weeks before Nazi Germany would surrender. News of his death stunned the nation. Americans wept openly in the streets. Factory workers stopped their machines. Children joined hands in prayer. To them, he was not merely a presidente, was a father, a compass, a steady hand through the darkest hours of their lives. Roosevelt did not live to witness the final victory, but he had already drawn the map that led there. The fateful day at Warm Springs, passing before the final victory Warm Springs once. The place where Franklin Delano Roosevelt reclaimed his body and spirit would now become the site of his final farewell. On April 12, 1945, the skies over Georgia were clear and quiet. Roosevelt was in the midst of a short rest, recovering from the unrelenting demands of wartime leadership. He sat at his desk in the modest cottage known as the Little White House, drafting the final lines of a speech he planned to deliver at the founding conference of the United Nations, an institution he had envisioned for over a decade. Then, in a sudden moment, he raised his head and quietly said to those nearby, "I have a terrific headache." Moments later, he collapsed. He never regained consciousness. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the only president ever elected to 4 terms, was gone at the age of 63. The news spread across the country and around the world with stunning speed. Within hours, the rhythm of life seemed to pause. Newspapers dropped their front pages. Radio broadcasters choked with emotion as they delivered the words, "President Roosevelt is dead." America grieved as though it had lost a father. No one could imagine a United States without him. For over 12 years, he had been a constant presence, from the depths of the Great Depression to the battlefields of World War II. Through every crisis, his voice had guided the nation, his words had steadied hearts, and his leadership had carried the weight of the world. His funeral was among the most solemn and moving ceremonies in American history. His body was transported from Warm Springs to Washington, wrapped in the American flag. Eleanor followed, silent and steadfast. People stood for hours in rain and darkness just to see him one last time. Soldiers, factory workers, school children, and seniors came not for formality but to say goodbye. Roosevelt did not live to see the German surrender. That would come just weeks later. He did not witness the final victory over Japan or the first gathering of the United Nations. But the roadmap, the faith, and the foundation for that future, they were his. To many Americans, Roosevelt never truly died. His image, seated in his wheelchair, cigarette in hand, eyes full of resolve, remained etched into the memory of a generation. He was not merely a wartime president. He was the beacon in the storm, the leader who had shepherded the nation through its darkest hours. Warm Springs, once a quiet retreat, became a place of pilgrimage. The small house where he took his final breath was preserved exactly as it was, a reminder that even giants must eventually fall. But what defines them is not how they die, but how they rise, fight, and change the course of history. The legacy of an immortal president, FDR, in the memory of humankind, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was more than a president. He was a symbol. When people speak of FDR, they don't just recall a man in a wheelchair with a cigarette holder and a steady voice on the radio. They remember a spirited, defiant will that rose above illness, skepticism, and crises that threatened to break a nation. During his 12 years in office, longer than any other U.S., President Roosevelt accomplished what many thought impossible. He revived a collapsed economy through the New Deal. He led a frightened people into confident global leadership. He united a fractured country through trust and compassion. And he laid the foundation for a post-war world built on peace and cooperation. His legacy doesn't live only in monuments or speeches. It lives in every streetlight built through public works, every bridge constructed by the WPA, every forest planted by the CCC. It lives in the savings protected by the FDIC. It lives in the idea of the United Nations world striving to replace war with diplomacy. But more than any policy, Roosevelt's greatest legacy is faith. Faith that, in the darkest hours, leadership can emerge not flawless, but honest. Not born heroic, but willing to grow, serve, and fight for what is right. Roosevelt did not look away from hard truths. He confronted them. He didn't promise magic, but he offered hope. He didn't rule by fear, but by the trust of the people. After his death, no grand inscription marked his grave. But in the hearts of millions, his name remains eternal, a president of the people, for the people, and with the people. And for that, he became more than a leader. He became a lasting symbol of resilience and humanity. He reminded the world, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he lived that truth until the very end. You've just listened to the extraordinary life story of Franklin D. Roosevelt, a courageous leader who rebuilt a nation and gave hope to the world during its darkest hours. Subscribe to Legends of Humanity to continue discovering the lives of legendary figures from across the globe, from visionary leaders and scientists to philosophers, artists, and unsung heroes whose legacies shaped the course of human history. Legends of Humanity, where history becomes an everlasting source of inspiration.